Welcome to the online module for crossover youth. This module presents the results of a study on delinquency trajectories of crossover youth. This module is the first in a series of 2 modules presenting research on crossover youth. The second module will discuss the current interventions for crossover youth and suggestions for the future intervention and study. Our project team at the University of Minnesota School of Social Work includes Wendy, Haight, Professor and Gamble-Skogmo Chair. We are grateful for the financial support of the Gamble-Skogmo Endowment and federal Title IV funding through the Minnesota Department of Human Services and the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare. We will present this module in 4 main sections. First, we will begin with an overview of developmental outcomes of crossover youth. Second, we will present delinquency trajectories, which are different by developmental stages. Next, we will present factors associated with risk of delinquency. Finally, we will discuss the implications of our findings on policy and practice for crossover youth. Today, we are going to build upon our previous modules listed in these slides. First, we are going to review some of the characteristics and developmental outcomes of crossover youth. It is well documented that maltreatment places children at an increased risk for delinquency. Overall, maltreated children are at a 47% greater risk for becoming delinquent than youth from the general population. Also, recurrences of maltreatment further increase youth's risk of delinquency and recidivism. Crossover youth are broadly defined as maltreated youth who have engaged in delinquency. As a result, they are involved in both the juvenile justice system and the child welfare system. Although kids can cross over in either direction, most often we see kids first showing up in the child welfare system and then subsequently crossing over into the juvenile justice system. Crossover youth likely experience a compounding of risks associated with maltreatment and involvement in child welfare and juvenile justice systems. Involvement in child welfare system, especially out-of-home placement, can place maltreated youth at further risk for psychosocial problems due to a disruption of family relationships and other positive contexts such as school and extracurricular activities. Maltreated youth tend to enter into the juvenile justice system at younger ages than their delinquent counterparts who are not maltreated. Early involvement of maltreated youth in the juvenile justice system can further compound their risks. Maltreated youth tend to receive harsher and biased treatment in the juvenile justice system than their counterparts without maltreatment histories. Juvenile offenders with maltreatment histories are more likely to be adjudicated and detained and to spend more time in custody. They are more likely to be placed in group home or correctional facilities rather than receiving probation. Such placements decrease youth's opportunities to engage in positive developmental activities in the community, such as part-time employment, youth sports, schools, clubs, etc. Exposure to these multiple risks and decreased positive developmental opportunities may be prolonged as maltreated youth tend to enter into the juvenile justice system at younger ages. These multiple compounding risks may place crossover youth at risk for a variety of problematic developmental outcomes. These outcomes include mental health, educational and vocational challenges, as well as adult criminal behaviors and maltreatment of their own children. For example, in Arizona, 80% of crossover youth had substance abuse problems. 61% had a history of prescribed psychotropic medications, and 27% reported suicidal attempts. In addition, 59% to 76% of crossover youth were chronically truant and were involved in special education and disciplinary systems. The early onset of delinquent behavior among crossover youth is a marker of increased risk for adult criminal behaviors. However, relatively little research considers the age of delinquent behavior for crossover youth to provide insight into any distinct risk and protective processes across development. Although existing studies examine a host of potential risk and protective processes at various social system levels, these studies typically aggregate into a single sample of maltreated youth crossing over at widely varying ages. The current study takes a developmental perspective in understanding maltreated youth who cross over into delinquency. Despite the evidence that maltreatment places youths at an increased risk for delinquency, there are a substantial number of maltreated youth who do not go on to commit delinquency. Wide variation in maltreated youth's developmental outcomes likely result from differences in exposure to risk and protective processes, as well as the developmental timing of those experiences. For maltreated youth, the timing of maltreatment and delinquency can be especially informative for the development of effective interventions that prevent delinquency or recidivism. Youth at different periods of development may exhibit different shape of offending trajectories and may be differently influenced by distinct risk and protective factors. The factors that predict offending of a group of younger and older youth may not be the same. There is no study in the crossover youth literature that examines differences in delinquency trajectory and risk and protective factors across development. So the purpose of this study is to examine delinquency trajectories of maltreated youth who cross over in early adolescence and mid-adolescence. We begin with these three research questions. First, what proportion of early and mid-adolescence youth who are maltreated cross over? Second, what are the delinquency trajectory for early and mid-adolescence youth? And last, what factors predict early and mid-adolescence youth will become involved with the juvenile justice system? To answer the research questions, this study was designed a prospective longitudinal study tracking the administrative records of two cohorts of maltreated youth in 3rd and 7th grades respectively in Minnesota public school system in academic year 2009. The 3rd graders were followed until grade 8 and are referred to as the early adolescence cohort in this study. The 7th graders were followed until grade 12 and are referred to as the mid-adolescence cohort. The two cohorts distinguished by development can assist in interpreting the effect of individual predictors in the context of developmental periods on delinquency. Data were obtained through the Minn-Link project at the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare in the School of Social Work at the University of Minnesota. Minn-Link holds statewide administrative data sets received from state departments of health, education, and human services. For the purpose of this study, An integrated dataset was created by merging several sources of state-level administrative data, as listed in this slide. Maltreated youth were identified as those who had at least one official record for one of or multiple allegations, including neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and other types of abuse. The subgroup of maltreated youth who became involved with the juvenile justice system was identified as those who were adjudicated, that is, found by the court to have committed the offense. Youth with only status offenses and traffic and technical violations were not considered to have crossed over in this study. The event of interest, crossing over, is the maltreated youth's first involvement in the juvenile justice system. The early adolescence cohort was drawn from a total of 62,248 third graders and the middle adolescence cohort from a total of 62,999 seventh graders who were enrolled in Minnesota public schools in academic year 2009. When we linked the education data with the child protection data, we identified 25,269 youth with maltreated histories. These youth had at least one official record for an allegation of maltreatment. Then we excluded youth whose first known maltreatment occurred subsequent to the study start date of September 1, 2008, yielding 9,304 youth. Of those youth, 194 youth were excluded because their offenses occurred prior to the study start date, yielding a final sample size of 9,110 youth. Descriptive statistics were used to examine demographic characteristics for youth in both cohorts. A life table was used to create the survival plot that visualizes crossover trajectories of the two cohorts. Cox proportional hazard regression was used to model time to youth's first involvement in the juvenile justice system and to identify factors associated with risk for crossing over in each age cohort. Cox regression analyses are used when researchers are interested in the likelihood of an event occurrence while considering information on the length of time for the event of interest to happen during a certain period of time. This table shows study sample characteristics. The two cohorts had the similar proportions of gender. The cohorts were primarily white, but youth of color were disproportionately represented. Youth with disabilities were also disproportionately represented in both cohorts. Of those youth, 5% and 7% of youth in early and mid-adolescence cohort respectively received individualized education programs for emotional behavior disabilities. A large majority of youth in both cohorts were from low-income families. Most youth in early adolescence cohort met state standards in reading and math tests, while most youth in mid-adolescence partially met the standards. Youth in both cohorts were attending school at rates similar to other youth in the state. Quite a few but significant numbers of maltreated youth had experienced out-of-school suspension before they crossed over. The mean ages at the first involvement in the child welfare system were 3.5 for early adolescence cohort and 6.7 for mid-adolescence cohort. The mid-adolescence cohort appeared lower in the number of youth who had more than 3 records for child protection service than the early adolescence cohort. Similarly, youth in the mid-adolescence cohort experienced out-of-home placement at a slightly lower rate than those the early adolescence cohort. This is a visual representation of the timing of the first involvement in the juvenile justice system for youth in both cohorts. Over the 6-year study period, approximately 7% of youth in the early adolescence and 16% of youth in the mid-adolescence cohort crossed over to juvenile justice system. The delinquency trajectory of the early adolescence youth is relatively flat until approximately 3 years when they were in 6th grade. The delinquency trajectory of the middle adolescence youth shows a relatively steady accumulation of crossing over with a slight leveling off at approximately 3 years when they were in 10th grade. The average number of days until the early adolescence cohort crossed over was 1,598 days and 1,055 days for the middle adolescence cohort. This table shows the results from the Cox regression analysis. A value greater than 1 in the hazard ratio in gray cells indicates a greater likelihood of involvement in the juvenile justice system by the end of the observation date. In both cohorts, boys were more likely than girls to cross over with a 54% and 64% increase in the hazard ratio for early and middle adolescence cohort respectively. Out-of-school suspension also was related to a higher hazard ratio in both cohorts. Youth who experienced out-of-school suspensions were more likely to engage in delinquency, with a 53% and 97% increase in the hazard ratio for early and middle adolescence cohort respectively. The effect of race, emotional behavior disabilities, and more than 3 maltreatment incidents were limited to the early adolescence cohort. Compared to white youth, Black, Hispanic, and Native American youth were more likely to cross over with an 81%, 73%, and 134% increase in the hazard ratio, respectively. Youth with emotional behavior disabilities were nearly 2 times more likely to cross over than those who did not have those disabilities. Youth with more than 3 maltreatment incidents were 2 times more likely to cross over than those who had less than 3 maltreatment incidents. For the middle adolescence cohort, academic achievement, out-of-home placement, and family socioeconomic status were significant predictors for their involvement in the juvenile justice system. Youth who received free reduced lunch were 30% more likely to cross over to the juvenile justice system than those who did not receive it. Youth with lower reading scores on the standardized test experienced an increased risk of crossover. An additional score in reading test was associated with a 1% decrease in the hazard ratio. Those who had out-of-home placement history experienced a 23% increase in the hazard ratio. This is a summary of the study findings. Delinquency trajectories appear different in its shape across development. The cohort of youth who first crossed over in mid-adolescence showed a relatively steady accumulation of crossing over relative to those who first crossed over in early adolescence. The rates of crossing over are 7% for the early adolescence cohort versus 16% for the mid-adolescence cohort. These rates are a little bit smaller than those in the existing studies of crossover youth, ranging from 9% to 29%. This may be due to differences in defining delinquency. While the most existing studies defined crossing over as arrest before youth touched the juvenile justice system, we did not have access to arrest data from police that include divergent cases. In this study, we used the court database, which means that we only had access to youth who had already touched both systems. There were similarities between youth cohorts who crossed over in early and middle adolescence. Males were more likely than females to become involved with both systems, as were youth who experienced out-of-school suspension. This finding is particularly universal across studies. Out-of-school suspension is also found to be a strong risk factor associated with delinquency in the literature. We also found some distinct risk factors for youth who first crossed over by early adolescence. The unique predictors are ethnicity, emotional behavior disabilities, and more than 3 maltreatment incidents. For youth who first crossed over in mid-adolescence, the unique predictors are socioeconomic status, reading score, and out-of-home placement. Here are some implications for practice and policy for crossover youth based on the study results. Identifying risks for maltreated youth's involvement in the juvenile justice system can inform the design of preventive interventions. The preventive interventions should consider maltreated boys with out-of-school suspension as a particular risk for becoming involved in the juvenile justice system. In addition, younger youth of color with emotional behavior disabilities and more than 3 reported instances of maltreatment should also be considered as an increased risk for juvenile justice system involvement. Older maltreated youth from families with low socioeconomic status, who have low reading scores, and who experienced out-of-home placements should also be considered as a heightened risk for crossing over. Here are some closing thoughts questions. First, what do you think are factors important to explaining the pathways from child maltreatment to delinquency? Second, do you know any interventions to reduce the involvement of maltreated youth in the juvenile justice system? Last, to what extent do you think those interventions address the risk and protective factors found in the current study? In the next module, we will review the current interventions for crossover youth with focus on their strengths and limitations, as well as empirical evidence for their effectiveness. Then, we will discuss future directions for the interventions based on what we learned from our study and the review of the current interventions for crossover youth. Thank you for watching this module. For more information about our crossover youth research, please contact Dr. Wendy Haight at this email address.